Kwe Tansei Seigo. Hi, my name is Palmater. Welcome back to another episode of State of the Nations, where we will talk about critical issues impacting Indigenous nations all over our sovereign territories on Turtle Island. Today what we're talking about is something that we shouldn't have to be talking about in 2017, gender equality for Indigenous women and children. It's hard to imagine with a feminist prime minister that this could even be an issue in a country like Canada, which has a charter which protects gender equality, which has numerous laws and human rights conventions that protect gender equality. Yet, because of the Liberal government's actions, we're forced here to talk about this issue. In 2015, shortly after the Prime Minister won his election and the Liberal government took over, the Prime Minister addressed the Special Assembly of Chiefs at the AFN and said uncategorically that there was no relationship more important to him than the one with Indigenous peoples. And to that end, he was committed to a renewed nation-to-nation relationship that would be based on recognition and implementation of all of our Aboriginal and treaty and other rights. Really profound words. Part of the problem is that he forgot to mention that this nation-to-nation relationship and that this newfound reconciliation with Indigenous peoples doesn't actually include Indigenous women and children. This is a huge problem. They forgot to also mention that when they were going to celebrate National Aboriginal Day on June 21st, that they were also going to make a historic vote against gender equality for Indigenous women and children. His entire government stood up and voted against ending gender inequality in the Indian Act for Indigenous women and children. Hard to reconcile those big lofty words with action in Parliament. And this is part of the problem when we're talking about basic issues for Indigenous peoples. So how can this be? This makes absolutely no sense in 2017. Gender discrimination in the Indian Act didn't make sense in 1925, 1951, 1970, 1985, and it certainly doesn't make sense in 2017. So what are we talking about? Well, right now the issue that's facing us is Bill S3. It's an amendment to the Indian Act which is supposed to once and for all eliminate all gender discrimination from the Indian registration provisions. Now, Indian registration is also known as Indian status. It's where an individual is recognized by the federal government as an Indian, and for the most part, it also confirms membership in a First Nation, also known as band membership. Now, historically, this has always been a problem in the Indian Act because the aim of the Indian Act has been to eliminate Indians. It's to make sure that eventually we're no longer here. And they haven't amended those portions of the Indian Act which will ensure that each First Nation has an extinction date. The primary way that they've tried to do this is by getting rid of Indian women and their children and supplementing them with non-Indian women and their non-Indian children. This is part of the history of the Indian Act and what Bill S3 was trying to address. Why was it trying to address that? It's because Canada lost yet another court case where Indigenous peoples came forward and said you simply cannot continue to discriminate against Indigenous women and their children and grandchildren in ways that make them unequal compared to Indigenous men and their children. And so they lost that court case. That was the Deschanel case. It came from the Quebec Superior Court. And in that case and the subsequent appearances before Justice Mass, she has all but pled with the federal government, would you please, once and for all, get rid of gender discrimination in the Indian Act. Stop making these piecemeal approaches. Stop trying to fix little tiny issues as a result of being forced by court cases and just do what you know you have to do. The Indian Act violates charter equality. So remedy that. But they continue and continue to resist. And this is something that we have actually been battling a long time. Since the Indian Act was created in 1876, the primary way to be recognized as an Indian would be to be a male Indian, the wife of a male Indian, or the child of a male Indian. That is still the primary way of being an Indian, subject to different kinds of amendments over time, whereas the best way to lose Indian status is to be born a female or be born to a female. And we've been trying to rectify that since 1876. There have been numerous Indigenous women activists trying to gain attention for this and make this change. Mary Two Acts Early was one of the very first champions of trying to get this addressed in the Indian Act. Jeanette Corbière-Laval, the former president of the Native Women's Association of Canada, and Yvonne Bedard from Six Nations actually sued Canada, sued them all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, saying that you can't discriminate against Indigenous women and their children in the Indian Act for having committed no other crime but for having married someone who wasn't recognized as an Indian. Part of the problem is the ongoing inequity in the Indian Act that stemmed from the rule that said if an Indian woman married someone who wasn't recognized as an Indian, she would lose her Indian status, and so would her kids and grandkids. But if an Indian man married a non-Indian woman, not only did he keep his Indian status, his non-Indian wife would gain status and their kids would be guaranteed status all the way down the line. So in trying to fix that, Canada has only addressed little tiny tidbits of gender discrimination and has not made Indian status equal for the entire time that there's been Indian status. So Indian men and all of their descendants still have better status than Indian women and all of their children of that category of those who married out. So we have a scenario where for many decades, people like Mary Two Acts Early, Jeanette Corbière-Laval, Yvonne Bedard, Sandra Lovelace, Sharon McIver, Lynn Gale, the litigants in the Deschanel case, and Jeremy Matson's case, and Nathan McGilvery. I mean, there's a long list of people who have either won their court cases or in the middle of court cases, which all center around the same issue, that gender discrimination in the Indian Act simply can't continue. Part of the problem is that even when we win a court case, Canada tries to limit the application of that court case and not really get rid of gender inequality. So while Mary Two Acts Early fought for full equality, Jeanette Corbière-Laval and Yvonne Bedard, they actually sued Canada at the Supreme Court of Canada in the early years. And that was under the Bill of Rights, which guaranteed equality. But of course, at that time, the Supreme Court of Canada said, well, there was never any intention that the equality provision would have any legislative impact, so they lost their case. But that enabled Sandra Lovelace, who is now Senator Sandra Lovelace Nicholas, to take her gender inequality claim all the way to the United Nations. And the United Nations agreed that the provisions under the Indian Act, which deny Indian women who married out and their children Indian status, denies them a fundamental right to have access and enjoy their culture together with other members of their community. This forced Canada to amend the Indian Act in 1985 to restore Indian status. But they didn't restore equal Indian status. They made sure that Indian men and white women and their children got to be registered under a section called 6(1)A. That's the status that everybody wants to have. It's the kind you can never lose. They registered Indian women who had married out under Section 61C, which is a lesser form of status, which identifies you, brands you, gives you a scarlet letter as you're a woman who married out. So you're registered under this lower section, which means that you can't pass on the same kind of Indian status as your brother registered under 61A. Which meant that all of their children are registered under Section 6.2, a half status, which means they can't pass on Indian status at all. So what did we do about this? We had to go and have another court case to deal with this, and that was Sharon McIver, who literally spent over 20 years fighting Canada in court, saying, you've still maintained gender discrimination, and it's excluded. Not only is it giving lesser status to my child, it's giving no status at all to my grandchildren, yet all of the kids of my brother have full Indian status. And that can't continue. She won her court case, but when Canada amended the Indian Act in 2010 to address this under Bill C-3, they didn't amend all gender discrimination. They maintained this hierarchy between 61A, men Indian and white women, versus 61C, Indian women and their descendants. And so she had to take her claim all the way to the United Nations, not unlike Sandra Lovelace, where Canada has been fighting against the United Nations, even rendering a decision on her case. So while she has been waiting years already for gender equality, her case is still languishing at international forums because Canada doesn't want them to render a decision. So while all of this is happening, more court cases are working their way through the system. And now you have Stéphane Deschanel and Tammy Yantha and a whole bunch of other litigants who won the Deschanel case out of the Quebec Superior Court, where, like I said, the Justice Mass literally begged Canada, would you please deal with gender discrimination? Instead, they come up with Bill S-3, which was introduced in the Senate, which would only deal with the Deschanel litigants and a couple of other minor scenarios. It would not remedy all gender discrimination, and it certainly wouldn't put Indian men and Indian women born prior to the 1985 amendments on an equal status, all registered under 61A, something that we call 61A all the way. And so you have this problem now where the minister herself, who committed to First Nations and also made commitments to the United Nations that Bill S-3 would in fact, like its title says, eliminate all gender discrimination in the Indian Act, she has now fiercely defended her right not to do that. She stands literally in direct opposition to gender equality. She claims that she has to consult with First Nations to see if she can continue to discriminate against Indigenous women and their children. And that makes absolutely no sense. If there is one issue that Canada has consulted on for decades and decades, it's gender discrimination in the Indian Act. They have undergone numerous consultative processes. The courts have told them over and over and over again, it's a federal law. The federal law in Canada is that you can't discriminate against women. You simply don't have any legal options to discriminate. Even if every First Nation in this country said, no, we don't want any women in our communities, you simply can't do that. And that's certainly not what First Nations have been calling for. In fact, when this bill was under study in the House and Parliament, there was a consensus amongst all of the Indigenous representatives that testified and women's organizations that there simply was no option to continue discriminating against Indigenous women and their children in the Indian Act. There was lots of discussion around what do we do about other issues, treaty rights, self-government, band membership, but when it comes to Indian status, it's a federal law that's subjected to federal law, and you cannot maintain gender discrimination. So it was very clear. It would have been very easy for the government to just say, okay, fine, we will comply with all of these court cases and have no gender discrimination. But instead, she refuses to do so, and not just her, but also Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould, who originally said that Bill S-3 was charter compliant, that it didn't discriminate against Indigenous women. Yet, federal officials admit through the study process, well, you know, it does still continue with gender discrimination, but we're going to deal with it at another time. So which is it? Is it discrimination or is it not? And certainly before the Justice Minister became Justice Minister, she signed numerous letters saying that the Indian Act contained gender discrimination, demanding that it be addressed. Well, now she's flip-flopping because she's a Liberal minister. Well, that certainly doesn't work for us. And Minister Bennett and Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould's position fly in the face of all of Canada's own laws. It violates Section 15 of the Charter, which guarantees equality between men and women in all federal legislation. It violates Section 35(4) of the Constitution Act, which not only guarantees and protects Aboriginal and treaty rights for First Nations people, but it must be guaranteed equally between male and female First Nations people. That's pretty direct if you ask me. It also violates Section 3 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, which says there can be no discrimination on the basis of gender. That's as clear as it gets. But the position of Minister Bennett and Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould literally flies in the face of every United Nations and international human rights body that's ever looked at Indian status and has told Canada, once and for all, get rid of gender discrimination. And it also contradicts the minister's statements to the United Nations in May, where she said, Canada unconditionally supports the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. Really? Canada unconditionally supports that because Article 44 actually says that all of the Indigenous rights contained in UNDRIP are guaranteed equally between male and female Indigenous peoples. So which is it? It either violates all of these acts or it doesn't. And I think it's pretty clear. You cannot maintain gender discrimination. And there's no excuse, okay? They can't even make the excuse about money. They've tried to fearmonger in the media. They've tried to say, oh, millions of people will be registered. No, it won't. The demographics simply don't sustain that. And even if it did, let's take a look at these numbers. In 2016 alone, just 2016, 392,902 Canadian babies were born. In addition to that, we had 305 new immigrants to Canada. That adds up to 700,000 new Canadians in Canada in 2016 alone. Now keep in mind, that would be added year after year after year. How many registered Indians are in Canada? Well, as of 2016, there's only 851,560 registered Indians. Essentially, it's almost the same amount of new Canadians that are added to the citizenship rolls every year as there are one group of Indigenous people registered under the Indian Act. We amount to less than 2% of the current population. Less than 2% are registered Indians. So if Canada can afford to pay for 700,000 new Canadians, new ones every year, it can certainly add a few Indigenous women and children. Why wouldn't we? There is no cost to gender equality. The courts don't even allow that as an excuse, administrative difficulty, or it would cost too much. You either have charter equality rights or you don't. And in fact, we do. And we also have to consider that the denial or loss of Indian status to many Indigenous peoples is a loss of identity, membership, the ability to reside in their communities, to enjoy Aboriginal and treaty rights, to enjoy their culture or have access to their communities or participate in their own governments. That all hinges on Indian status. And it's easy to say, okay, the Indian Act is bad and it's a tool of colonization, and someday maybe we'll get rid of the Indian Act and that our real identities are Mi'kmaq and Cree and Anishinaabe. All of that is true, but that ignores the political, legal, and social reality on the ground, which excludes Indigenous women and children based on Indian status. That is a powerful tool used to exclude us from our communities. So the reality is, under Indigenous laws, under Indigenous traditions and practices, under Canadian laws, and under international laws, there is no legal justification for excluding Indigenous women and children from our First Nations anymore. There simply isn't. There's nothing to consult about. It should be a done deal. But the reality is the government is fighting us all the way. It's always fighting Indigenous women because we are the heart of our communities. We bring life to our nations. We sustain our nations. We have an important and significant role in maintaining our nations. And Canada's view is to eliminate our nations. So in fact, it's in the interest of every First Nation in this country to ensure that Indigenous women are included, because we ensure our survival by doing so. Gender equality under the Indian Act is not going to bring back all of the people that Canada murdered through scalping laws, forced sterilizations, death in residential schools, starlight tours, deaths in police custodies, deaths in prisons, deaths on the streets, or murdered and missing Indigenous women. I know that. It is not going to bring all of our people back. But Canada's genocide against our people made us lose millions. We have less than 1 million left, and many of our rightful citizens are excluded. The least we can do, if we are truly serious about nation building, and if we are truly serious about reconciliation, is ending one of the root causes of murdered and missing Indigenous women, which is gender discrimination in the Indian Act. And I implore all of you to put pressure on your senators and MPs and committees and First Nation leaders to make sure that this is dealt with once and for all. No more gender discrimination. It's literally a matter of life and death. Thank you for watching another episode of State of the Nations. If you would like to hear more episodes or longer episodes, please consider supporting my channel by subscribing or liking the videos, sharing with your friends and families and social justice allies, and providing comments below about what kinds of issues you would like me to talk about. Thank you.